Well, today I'm at Mather-Voyce Cemetery in East Leroy. It used to be called the East Leroy Cemetery. And so today I'm going to do some exploring of history here and see what stories that I can find. Come along and join me.
The Mather-Voyce Cemetery is located on 5 Mile Road between H Drive and K Drive in Leroy Township. According to the Leroy Township website, it had its beginning as a small cemetery on the pioneer farm of George Johnson, who's buried at this cemetery, and his monument says he died in 1873. The first burial, according to the headstones, is that of Mary Watkins, wife of A.B. Watkins, who died in 1838 at the age of 37. The cemetery was originally known as the East Leroy Cemetery and later as the Mather Cemetery. Sometime after 2007, the name was changed to Mather-Voyce Cemetery. In 1991, the cemetery had a windstorm which came through and knocked down many of the old pine trees and damaged some of the headstones in the process. The same storm also tossed around some local hogs. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sure, when pigs fly. But it did happen, according to this article. Someone since that time has devoted a lot of time and effort to repairing and restoring damaged headstones in the cemetery and has done a remarkable job. Some of the damage may have been from the storm in 1991 or from vandalism over the years. Many of the older markers in the cemetery, you can tell, have been mended back together and are once again readable. So kudos to whomever has been doing this restoration. Because of where the cemetery is located, the stories I'm about to share will include people from both Leroy Township and Newton Township. Some of my viewers have asked me a few times to cover some stories of Newton Township, so here we are. The name Voyce comes from the Voyce family, better known in East Leroy for owning and operating the grain elevator. As far as I was able to determine, there's only one member of the Voyce family currently buried here, Patsy Voyce, who passed away in 2016. She's buried in the newer section of the cemetery, so perhaps the Voyce family acquired several plots in the cemetery and thus the name was added. That's just my guess. However, if someone is out there watching this and has more information on the timeline and the name changes and the reason for these changes to this cemetery, please be so kind as to leave a comment and correct the record on it for me. The name Mather comes from David and Henrietta Mather. There's a short biography written on him in the book Biographical Review of Calhoun County, Michigan, which was published in 1904 by a company called Chicago, Hobart, and Mather. One could suppose the Mather in this company name was a distant relative. The Mather family can trace their ancestral history to Richard Mather, a noted member of the clergy who came from England to Boston, Massachusetts in 1635. David's father was Enos Mather, and his mother was Tamar Houghton, both of whom died in New York. David was born in the town of Royalton, Niagara County, New York on January 26, 1838. He was raised on the home farm and acquired a good education. He later engaged in farming in the summer months, while in the winter season he followed the profession of teaching in the Empire State until 1872. He then went to Michigan, settling in Leroy Township. He purchased a farm and continued its cultivation for 12 years until he turned his attention on merchandising and grain dealing. He built a store and stocked it with a general line of merchandise, but found working indoors in a store all the time was detrimental to his health. So after 6 years, he sold the store. He then became the proprietor of a lumber yard in East Leroy, which he continued for another 6 years before he removed to Athens, Michigan. He established a lumber yard in Athens, and this time also dealt in coal, lime, cement, and all kinds of building materials. His business steadily grew over the years and gained him a large patronage with the community. In 1866, while he was still living in New York, he married Henrietta Miller, and together they had 2 sons. His older son Charles started his own lumber company in Milan, Michigan, and his younger son Frank remained working with him in his business in Athens. David served in the village council in Athens, and at one time served as as the village clerk in East Leroy. In addition to his business in Athens, he also owned 119 acres in Leroy Township. He passed away in 1913 at the age of 74. Henrietta passed away in 1920 at the age of 75. The next story is that of George Reynolds Merchant, who was born in Glenville, Sarasota County, New York on January 22, 1819. His grandfather was Gurdon Merchant, who was a native of Connecticut and served with George Washington in the Revolutionary War. His father was Joel Merchant, who participated in the Battle of Lundy's Lane in the War of 1812. This was also known as the Battle of Niagara, and it was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought in Canada. Today, there's a monument in Niagara Falls to this event. George's mother was Esther Reynolds, a descendant of the pilgrims who came to England in the Mayflower in 1620. George Merchant came to Michigan in 1840, journeying to Detroit on foot, and learned the trade of a cooper, which is the craft of creating wooden barrels. The company he worked for manufactured flour barrels. This was at a time that every piece of barrel was made by hand from raw materials, and George had been taken into an apprenticeship to learn this trade. He would later abandon this apprenticeship and head west, settling in Calhoun County. In 1840 to 1841, he taught school in Newton Township in the winter and also engaged in farming in the summer, working on local farms. He had previously been training as a teacher in New York and had taught for several terms there. He would go on to teach a total of 8 terms between New York and Newton Township. In 1843, he married Eliza Brought, and together they would have 9 children, of which 7 made it to adulthood, 2 sons and 5 daughters. He would eventually purchase his own farm, which would grow to 170 acres. Over the years, he brought his land from an untamed wilderness condition to one of the best farms in the township. He was a resident of the county for over 40 years, and at the time of his death, he was remembered as a man who was considerate of others, enlightened in his views, and a substantial and trustworthy citizen in the community. He passed away in September of 1894 at the age of 75. The next story is a tragic one. Reuben and Adeline, Addie, as she was known, Hart, were residents of East Leroy. On Christmas Day, they were having their relatives over at their home for the family holiday gathering. Towards the end of the evening, as the guests were preparing to leave, Addie suggested they would have some tea before they departed. She began preparing this in the kitchen when she tragically poured kerosene on the hot coals, either by intent or accident. It wasn't very clear. The result was an explosion, and she caught herself on fire. The family carried her blazing from the home and smothered out the fire with quilts and rugs. She was badly burned on her face, lips, ears, and nostrils. From the injuries described, one can assume she was leaning over the stove when the explosion hit her in the face. She died the following morning from her injuries. She was 62 years old. Reuben would live for another 8 years, and around Thanksgiving 1916, he was in poor health. The family, trying to raise his spirits, held a reunion at his place for the holiday, and he enjoyed seeing one of his daughters who had come to visit from Idaho as well. At the end of the evening, however, his condition had gotten worse, and he would eventually pass away a few days later on Monday, December 4th. He was 75 years old. The Record family is also buried in this cemetery. Julian Record was born in 1855 in Minnesota, and he married Euphemia Nickerson. At some point, they lived in Tennessee for a time before moving to Michigan and settling in Leroy Township. Together, they would have 2 sons. Julian passed away in 1917 at his home. His wife, Euphemia, passed away in 1926 after a long illness. One of their sons, Warren Record, would serve in World War I, and he died at the Veterans Bureau Hospital in Chicago in 1932. His brother, Paul Record, was a resident of Leroy Township for 43 years and worked as a Battle Creek mail carrier for 16 years. He married Pearl Vetter, and together they would have 5 daughters and 3 sons. Paul died in December of 1940 after an illness that lasted about 11 weeks. He was just 50 years old. His wife Pearl worked in the kitchen at the old American Legion Hospital and later at Percy Jones Hospital until 1960. She then did domestic work for another 10 years before she retired in 1970. She would pass away in May of 1989 at the age of 93. Julian, Euphemia, Warren, Paul, and Pearl Record are all buried in this cemetery. Charles and Christina Yarrington are buried in this cemetery as well. He was born in New York in 1844, and she was born in Germany in 1846. I was not able to uncover much about their lives other than a few interesting facts. They lived in Leroy Township, but he had served in the Mexican-American War, which occurred between April 1846 and February 1848. He passed away in 1901 at the age of 57. Christina, in March of 1902, would be awarded a widow's pension of $12 for Charles' service in that war. Widow's pensions were a benefit provided by Congress for the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War, payable to the surviving widows after the soldier died, for 7 years after his death. The pension laws would change after the Civil War and again after World War I. Christina would pass away in 1904 at the age of 57. The final story in this cemetery may be a forgotten one, but in his time, this man was considered to be an individual of rare ability and integrity and a worthy representative of the spirited pioneers who settled Calhoun County. He also received a special biography in Washington Gardner's book, History of Calhoun County. John Wagner was born in Württemberg, Germany in 1818 and was brought up and educated, obtaining not only a good knowledge of German, but also the English language. He immigrated to America in 1838 and lived for 7 years in Cleveland, Ohio. It was there that he met and married Susan Grant. Susan was born in London, England, and at the age of 7 years old, immigrated with her parents to the U.S., and they became among the older and more prominent settlers in Cleveland, Ohio. Together, John and Susan would have 11 children, but only 2 sons and 5 daughters lived to adulthood. 2 of their infants, George and Charles, both living exactly 1 year and 7 months, died 2 years apart and are buried side by side in the family plot, as is another child named Mary, who was only 6 months old. John and Susan left Ohio in 1845, traveling with their 2-year-old daughter, Julia, in a covered wagon, settling in Leroy Township. He purchased 80 acres of land, where he not only worked his own land, but for several seasons, he earned money working on other neighboring farms as a laborer. He would eventually grow his farm to the size of 240 acres. Here is his land on the 1873 atlas, which is located just north of the cemetery off of 5 Mile Road. He also served his community by running for public office. For 5 years, from 1865 to 1870, he was the supervisor of Leroy Township. He also served as a township treasurer from 1864 to 1867. And in 1868, he was elected to the state legislature and remained true in his service to his constituents from 1869 to 1870. At this time, it was the 3rd district from Calhoun County, which represented the city of Battle Creek and its 4 wards, along with the townships of Athens, Leroy, Battle Creek, Bedford, Penfield, and Convis. After his service in the state legislature, he again was elected as a Leroy Township treasurer in 1873. He passed away on December 15th, 1876, and he's buried here at the Mather-Voyce Cemetery. His wife Susan died in July of 1893 at the age of 71. On the 1894 atlas, the farm is still indicated as being held in his wife's name. One of their children, as mentioned before, named Julia, met a young boy named Ashbury Liebarker when she was attending the log school for her education. Ashbury was a relative of a man named Smoloff Wood, who ran one of the famous taverns of the day along the Athens stagecoach route. Ashbury would go off to fight in the Civil War, and he returned home safely. Ashbury and Julia got married when he returned and eventually moved in 1874 to the unpopulated country of northern Michigan, settling in an area which would later become known as Mansalona. They would have one daughter named Minnie. Juliet ran a successful dressmaking business in Mansalona, and when her husband passed away in 1892, she returned to her familiar childhood neighborhood in East Leroy with her daughter and remained here until she died in 1929. She's buried in the same cemetery as her father, along with other members of her family. At the time of her death, only 2 of the original 11 children of John and Susan Wagner were still living. They were her sisters Josephine Vaughn, who's buried in this cemetery, and Mrs. Cora Blackett of Battle Creek.
So that's going to conclude today's journey through history here at the Mather-Voyce Cemetery. If you liked today's video, please take a minute to hit the like button down there, subscribe to the channel, and share the video with others. And if you get a minute, check out my podcast, Tales of Southwest Michigan's Past, where I get to explore a lot of other stories that I don't always have time to put to video form. So until next time, thanks for watching.